The door rattled against its hinges at 2:30 in the morning, and Ethan Hawthorne rolled out of bed with his Colt already in hand, heart hammering against his ribs like a wild Mustang trying to break free. Nobody came calling at this hour in Riverton, Wyoming, unless something had gone terribly wrong or someone was looking for trouble. The September wind howled through the gaps in the timber walls of his ranch house, carrying with it the scent of sage and distant rain. He moved quietly across the rough wooden floor, years of careful living having taught him which boards would creak and which would stay silent. Through the window he could make out a dark shape on his porch, smaller than he expected, hunched against the cold. "Please." The voice was feminine, barely audible over the wind. "Please, I am looking for Ethan Hawthorne." He lowered the gun slightly but did not set it down. His brother had been the one to place the advertisement back in Boston, back before the consumption had taken him last winter. Ethan had forgotten all about it in the grief and the endless work of keeping the ranch running alone. But now, standing in his nightshirt with the autumn wind cutting through every crack in the walls, he remembered the letter Michael had shown him, the one he had laughed about and told his brother was foolish. "I am Ethan Hawthorne," he said through the door, his voice rough with sleep and caution. "I am Rosalie Kimball. I have traveled from Boston. Your brother, he wrote to me. He said you needed a wife." The words hit him like a physical blow. Michael, always trying to take care of him, even from beyond the grave. Ethan stood there for a long moment, torn between sending her away and opening the door. But the wind picked up again, fierce and biting, and he heard her teeth chattering through the wood. He made his decision in an instant. Setting the gun on the table beside the door, he threw the bolt and pulled it open. The woman standing there was wrapped in a thin traveling coat that had seen better days, her dark hair plastered to her face by the wind and what looked like recent tears. She carried a single carpet bag that appeared to contain everything she owned in the world. Her eyes were large and dark in the lamplight spilling from his doorway, and there was something in them that spoke of desperation mixed with determination. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. She hesitated only a moment before crossing the threshold, and as she did, Ethan found himself moving through the house with purpose. He went to the fireplace first, building up the banked coals until flames began to lick at the new wood. Then he moved through the front room, lighting the oil lamp on the mantel. He continued to the kitchen, lighting the lamp there. He went to his bedroom and lit the lamp beside his bed, then to the spare room where Michael had slept during his final months. Every lamp in the house he lit, one after another, until the entire place glowed warm and golden against the dark Wyoming night. When he returned to the front room, Rosalie stood exactly where he had left her, dripping onto his floor, watching him with an expression he could not quite read. Her whole body trembled, though whether from cold or fear or something else entirely, he could not tell. "Stay," he said, the word coming out more command than invitation, but he softened it by adding, "at least until morning. Until you are warm and dry and have had something to eat. Then we can talk about what happens next." She nodded slowly, and he saw her shoulders drop slightly as if she had been carrying a tremendous weight and could finally set it down, if only for a moment. "Thank you," she whispered. He showed her to the spare room, found her one of Michael's old shirts to sleep in since she was shivering so hard she could barely hold her carpet bag. He heated water on the stove and brought her a basin to wash with, along with a towel that was rough but clean. Then he left her alone and went to stoke the fire higher, trying to process the fact that there was now a woman in his house, a woman who had traveled 2,000 miles because his brother had promised her a husband. Sleep would not come again that night. Ethan sat in his chair by the fire, watching the flames dance and thinking about Michael. His younger brother had been the charming one, the one who made friends easily and saw the good in everyone. When the doctor had told them about the consumption, Michael had taken it with more grace than Ethan thought possible. But he had also become obsessed with making sure Ethan would not be alone. "You cannot run this ranch by yourself forever," Michael had said, his voice already weakened by the disease eating away at his lungs. "And you cannot spend your whole life alone, Ethan. That is no way to live." Ethan had argued, of course. He was 32 years old and had been alone for most of his adult life. He knew how to survive, how to make do. But Michael had been insistent, and in the end, Ethan had agreed to let him place the advertisement, mostly to give his dying brother some peace. He had not expected anyone to actually respond. As the first gray light of dawn began to creep through the windows, Ethan heard movement from the spare room. He stood and went to the kitchen, starting coffee and pulling out the skillet to make breakfast. By the time Rosalie emerged, he had eggs frying and bread toasting on the stove top. She looked different in the morning light. Younger than he had first thought, perhaps 25 or 26. Her hair, now dry, fell in dark waves past her shoulders. She had changed back into her own dress, a gray wool that had been mended in several places but was clean and neat. There were shadows under her eyes that spoke of exhaustion deeper than just one sleepless night. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the table. "Breakfast will be ready in a moment." She sat carefully, as if afraid the chair might break beneath her, and folded her hands in her lap. "You do not have to feed me. I know this is not what you expected." "I do not know what I expected," Ethan said honestly, dividing the eggs between two plates. "But you are here, and you are hungry, so you will eat." They ate in silence for a while, the only sounds the scrape of forks against plates and the crackle of the fire. Ethan found himself stealing glances at her, trying to reconcile this flesh and blood woman with the vague idea he had held of a mail-order bride. She ate with careful manners but obvious hunger, and he found himself putting more bread on her plate without asking. "Tell me about Boston," he said finally, because the silence was becoming uncomfortable, and he genuinely wanted to know what would drive a woman to travel across the entire country, to marry a stranger. Rosalie set down her fork and looked at him directly for the first time since sitting down. "There is not much to tell. My father died 5 years ago. My mother passed last spring. I worked in a textile mill, but the wages barely covered my rent. When I saw your brother's advertisement, it seemed like Providence was offering me a way forward." "What did the advertisement say?" Ethan asked. He had never actually read it himself. A faint color rose in her cheeks. "It said you were a rancher in Wyoming, that you were looking for a wife who was not afraid of hard work and could handle the isolation of ranch life. It said you were an honest man who would provide for a family, but needed someone to help build that family with you." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. That sounded like Michael, painting the best possible picture while still being essentially truthful. "My brother wrote that." "Yes. We corresponded for 3 months. He told me about the ranch, about Wyoming, about you. He made it sound like a good life." "And then he died," Ethan said quietly. "Yes." She looked down at her plate. "I received a letter from a Mr. Patterson, who I gather is your solicitor. He told me about your brother's passing, and said he felt obligated to inform me that our arrangement might no longer stand. But by then, I had already sold everything I owned to buy my train ticket. I had nowhere else to go." The admission hung in the air between them. Ethan felt a surge of anger at Michael for putting him in this position, followed immediately by guilt for being angry at his dead brother. It was not Michael's fault that he had died. It was not Rosalie's fault that she had come anyway. But here they were, two strangers bound together by circumstance and a promise made by someone who could no longer keep it. "I will not force you to marry me," he said finally. "I am not that kind of man, but I meant what I said last night. You can stay here at least for a while. Long enough to figure out what you want to do next." She looked up at him, and he saw relief warring with something else in her eyes. Pride, maybe, or stubbornness. "I did not come here looking for charity. I am not offering charity. I am offering you time." He pushed back from the table and stood. "This ranch is more than one person can handle alone. If you want to earn your keep while you are here, there is plenty of work. But I will not marry a woman I just met in the middle of the night. And I will not send a woman back out into the world with nothing just because my fool brother made promises he could not keep." He regretted the words as soon as they left his mouth, the harshness of them, but Rosalie did not flinch. Instead, she nodded slowly. "That seems fair," she said. "I am good with animals. I can cook and clean and mend. I am not afraid of hard work." "Good," Ethan said. "Because I have 40 head of cattle, 6 horses, 2 dozen chickens, and a ranch that is held together mostly by hope and determination. You can start by gathering eggs while I see to the horses." They fell into a routine over the next few days that surprised them both with its ease. Rosalie rose with the sun and had coffee ready by the time Ethan came in from his first round of chores. She proved to be a capable cook, turning his simple supplies into meals that were better than anything he had eaten since Michael died. She cleaned the house from top to bottom, scrubbing away months of bachelor neglect, and mended every piece of clothing he owned. For his part, Ethan found himself teaching her about the ranch. She had not been lying about being good with animals. The horses took to her immediately, and even his most temperamental mare would eat from Rosalie's hand. She learned quickly how to feed the chickens, how to check the cattle for injury or illness, how to mend a fence, and read the weather in the clouds rolling in from the mountains. They talked while they worked, sharing stories in bits and pieces. Ethan learned that her father had been a clerk and her mother a seamstress, that Rosalie had one younger sister who had married and moved to Philadelphia, that she loved to read, but had been forced to sell most of her books before leaving Boston. He told her about growing up in Missouri, about coming west with Michael after their parents died, about building the ranch from nothing over the course of 10 years. What he did not talk about, and what she did not ask about, was what would happen next. The question hung between them like morning mist, present but unacknowledged. 3 weeks after her arrival, the first real storm of autumn rolled in from the north. Ethan saw it coming in the afternoon, the sky turning dark and heavy with the promise of rain or possibly early snow. He hurried to secure everything that might blow away and get the animals into shelter, working with the kind of focused urgency that came from years of experience with Wyoming weather. Rosalie worked beside him without being asked, understanding instinctively what needed to be done. By the time the first drops began to fall, they were both soaked through and breathing hard, but everything was secure. They ran for the house together, and Ethan found himself laughing as they burst through the door, something he had not done in longer than he could remember. Rosalie was laughing too, her hair plastered to her face and her dress clinging to her in a way that made Ethan quickly look away. He busied himself with building up the fire while she went to change, very aware of the intimacy of their situation. They were alone together in this house, miles from the nearest neighbor, and had been for weeks now. If anyone in town knew, her reputation would be in tatters. The thought sobered him. When she emerged in dry clothes, he was sitting by the fire with his jaw tight and his thoughts heavy. "What is wrong?" she asked, taking the chair across from him. "People will talk," he said bluntly. "About you living here alone with me. It will not be kind talk." She was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. "I know," she said finally. "I have been thinking about that too. I can take you into town tomorrow, introduce you to some people. The preacher's wife might know of a respectable place you could stay, a family that needs help or something like that. Is that what you want?" Her voice was carefully neutral. Ethan realized he did not know how to answer that. What he wanted had become complicated over the past few weeks. He had grown accustomed to her presence, to having someone to talk to over breakfast, to the way she hummed while she worked, to coming inside and finding the house warm and welcoming instead of cold and empty. "I want you to be safe," he said carefully. "I want you to have choices." "I had choices," Rosalie said, and there was steel in her voice now. "I chose to come here. I chose to stay, and I am choosing now to tell you that I do not want to leave." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw that the frightened woman who had appeared on his doorstep in the middle of the night was gone. In her place was someone stronger, someone who had found her footing and knew her own mind. "Then what do you want?" he asked quietly. "I want what I came here for," she said. "A home, a life, a partnership with someone who will treat me with respect." She paused, then added, "Your brother wrote that you were an honest man and a good one. I have seen nothing in these weeks to contradict that. Have you found me lacking in some way?" "No," Ethan said immediately. "You have been everything you said you would be and more, but marriage is not something to rush into. It is not a business arrangement." "Is it not?" Rosalie leaned forward, her eyes intent on his face. "For people like us, maybe that is exactly what it is." "I am not asking you to love me, Ethan. I am asking you to give me a chance to build something real here. The rest can come later, or it might not come at all. But at least we would both have a partner, someone to share the load with." The rain hammered against the windows, and the wind howled around the corners of the house. Ethan thought about the long winter ahead, about the work that would need to be done, about the lonely nights he had spent in this house since Michael died. He thought about the way Rosalie laughed when one of the chickens pecked at her boots, about how she always made sure his coffee was hot when he came in from the cold, about the way she had fit into his life as if there had always been a Rosalie-shaped space just waiting for her. "All right," he said, and watched her face light up with something that looked like hope. "But we do this properly. I will take you into town tomorrow. We will talk to the preacher. We will do this right." She nodded, and for the first time since she had arrived, she smiled at him without reservation. It transformed her face, making her beautiful in a way that made his heart stutter in his chest. They were married 3 days later in the small church in Riverton, with the preacher's wife and the general store owner serving as witnesses. Rosalie wore a simple blue dress that she had brought with her from Boston, and Ethan wore his cleanest shirt and the suit he had last worn to Michael's funeral. The ceremony was brief and practical, but when the preacher told him he could kiss his bride, Ethan found himself hesitating. Rosalie solved the problem by standing on her toes and pressing a quick, chaste kiss to his lips. It was over almost before it began, but Ethan felt the warmth of it all the way back to the ranch. That night, they lay beside each other in his bed, stiff and awkward, both staring at the ceiling. Ethan had offered to sleep in the spare room, but Rosalie had pointed out that they were married now and married people shared a bed. Still, there was a careful distance between them, a space neither seemed ready to cross. "Thank you," Rosalie said softly into the darkness, "for giving me a chance." "Thank Michael," Ethan replied. "He is the one who started all this." "No," she said. "Michael may have written the advertisement, but you are the one who opened the door. You are the one who lit every lamp in the house and told me to stay." He turned his head to look at her, though he could make out only the vague shape of her in the darkness. "I could not send you back out into the cold. Many men would have." They lapsed into silence again, but it was a more comfortable silence than before. Eventually, Ethan felt her breathing even out as she fell asleep. He lay awake longer, thinking about the strange turn his life had taken and wondering if he had made the right choice. But when he finally drifted off, it was with a sense of peace he had not felt in a very long time. The autumn deepened into winter, and with it came the hard work of preparing for the months of snow and cold ahead. Ethan and Rosalie worked side by side from dawn until long after dark, hauling hay, checking fence lines, making sure every animal had adequate shelter. They learned each other's rhythms, anticipating what the other needed without having to ask. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, Ethan mending tack while Rosalie read aloud from the books he had ordered for her from a catalog. He discovered that she loved poetry and adventure stories, that her voice took on different qualities when she read different characters, that she would sometimes stop mid-sentence to discuss something that had caught her interest. He found himself looking forward to these evenings more than he wanted to admit. There was something deeply satisfying about having someone to share the quiet hours with, someone whose presence made the house feel like a home instead of just a place to sleep between long days of work. The first snow came in early November, light flurries that dusted the ground but did not stick. The second snow, a week later, was more serious. Ethan woke to find the world transformed, everything covered in a thick blanket of white that muffled sound and turned familiar landmarks strange. He moved carefully around the house, trying not to wake Rosalie, but she was up almost as soon as he was, pulling on layers of clothing and wrapping a thick shawl around her shoulders. "The animals," she said simply, and he nodded. They spent the morning breaking ice in water troughs and making sure the cattle had not wandered too far in the storm. It was cold, brutal work, the kind that left your hands aching and your face numb despite the scarves wrapped around your nose and mouth. But they managed it together, and when they finally stumbled back into the house hours later, they were both exhausted but triumphant. Rosalie made coffee while Ethan built up the fire, and they sat together at the kitchen table, warming their hands around their cups and not speaking. There was no need for words. They had done what needed to be done, and they had done it together. It was in that moment, watching Rosalie's wind-burned cheeks slowly return to their normal color, that Ethan realized he was falling in love with his wife. The realization terrified him. He had married her as a practical arrangement, a solution to both their problems. Love had not been part of the bargain. Love meant vulnerability, meant opening himself up to the kind of pain he had felt when his parents died, when Michael died. He was not sure he was ready for that. But as the weeks passed, he could not deny what was growing between them. It was there in the way she smiled at him over breakfast, in the way she would rest her hand on his arm when she passed behind his chair, in the way she had started saying "we" instead of "I" when talking about the ranch. It was there in the way his heart lifted every time he came in from the barn and saw lamplight glowing in the windows, knowing she was inside waiting for him. Christmas came and went quietly. They were snowed in for 3 days, and Ethan used the time to carve Rosalie a small wooden box for her few precious possessions. She gave him a new scarf she had knitted from wool she had carefully unraveled from an old blanket and respun. They were simple gifts, but meaningful, and when she kissed him in thanks, it lasted longer than that first kiss at the altar had. The winter nights were long and dark, and slowly, carefully, the distance between them in bed began to shrink. First it was just their hands touching, then their shoulders. Then one particularly cold night in January, Rosalie pressed herself against his back for warmth, and Ethan found himself turning to wrap his arms around her. She fit perfectly against him, her head tucked under his chin, and when he pressed a kiss to her hair, she sighed contentedly. "Ethan," she whispered, "I need to tell you something." His heart clenched. What is it? I think I am falling in love with you. The words hung in the air between them, vulnerable and honest. Ethan tightened his arms around her and pressed another kiss to her hair, then her forehead, then finally, gently, to her lips. I know I am falling in love with you, he said against her mouth and felt her smile. What followed was a slow exploration, tentative at first but growing bolder as they learned each other's bodies, the way they had learned each other's work rhythms. It was sweet and awkward and perfect, and when it was over they lay tangled together, Rosalie's head on his chest and his fingers trailing through her hair. I am glad I knocked on your door, she said sleepily. I am glad I opened it, he replied. Spring came late to Wyoming that year, but when it finally arrived, it brought with it a sense of renewal. The snow melted, revealing grass that would soon turn green. The cattle, lean from the hard winter but alive, spread out across the pastures. Birds returned from wherever they had gone, filling the air with song. Ethan and Rosalie worked to repair the damage winter had done to fences and buildings, but the work felt lighter now, buoyed by the growing warmth between them. They had settled into their marriage fully, and there was no longer any awkwardness between them. They moved around each other with the ease of a long married couple, finishing each other's sentences and communicating as much with looks as with words. In April, Rosalie came to him one morning with news that made his heart soar. She was pregnant. The baby would come in late autumn, she thought, right around the time she had first arrived. Ethan picked her up and spun her around, laughing, before carefully setting her back down and fussing over whether she should be doing heavy work. She rolled her eyes at him, but allowed him to take on some of the tasks she had been handling, though she refused to be treated like an invalid. As her belly grew, Ethan found himself constantly amazed by the changes in her body, by the life growing inside her. He would rest his hand on her stomach in the evenings, feeling the baby kick, and marvel at the fact that they had created this together. It seemed impossible that less than a year ago he had been alone in this house, resigned to a solitary life. The summer was hot and busy, but they managed the work together. Rosalie proved to be a natural with the ranch accounts, organizing his haphazard record, keeping into something that actually made sense. She also started a garden, growing vegetables that would help them through the next winter, and she made friends with some of the women in town who came to help her with sewing clothes for the baby. In August, a letter arrived from Boston. It was from Rosalie's sister, Helen, and it contained news both good and bad. Helen's husband had died in an accident at the factory where he worked, leaving her alone with 2 small children and no income. She was desperate. Rosalie read the letter aloud to Ethan, her voice shaking, and then looked at him with fear in her eyes. She needs help, she said. But I cannot leave you, not now, not with the baby coming. We will bring her here, Ethan said immediately. Your sister and her children. There is room and we could use the extra help. More importantly, she is family. Rosalie burst into tears and he held her while she cried, rubbing her back and murmuring reassurances. When she finally pulled away, her eyes were red but shining. Are you sure? She asked. 2 children. They will be loud and chaotic. Your peaceful house will be turned upside down. Ethan thought about the house as it had been before Rosalie arrived, cold and quiet and lonely. He thought about how alive it felt now, with Rosalie's laughter and singing filling the rooms. He imagined children running through it, his and hers both, and found that he liked the image very much. I am sure, he said. Write to her. Tell her to come. Helen arrived in September with her children, a boy of 5 and a girl of 3. She was thin and exhausted, her eyes holding the kind of grief that Ethan recognized all too well. But when she saw Rosalie, heavily pregnant and glowing with health and happiness, she broke down sobbing. The sisters held each other for a long time while Ethan occupied the children, showing them the horses and the chickens and trying to make them feel welcome. The boy, Samuel, was shy but curious. The girl, Martha, clung to her mother at first but gradually warmed up to the animals. Helen settled into the spare room, and with her help, the household ran even more smoothly. She was a talented seamstress, taking over that work and freeing Rosalie to focus on the heavier tasks she insisted on doing despite her pregnancy. The children brought life and noise to the ranch, and Ethan discovered that he did not mind it at all. In fact, he found himself looking forward to when his own child would be old enough to run and play and ask endless questions about everything. In late October, on a clear, cold night, Rosalie went into labor. Helen sent Samuel running for the doctor in town while she and Ethan did their best to make Rosalie comfortable. It was a long labor, lasting through the night and into the next day, and there were moments when Ethan felt helpless and terrified, able to do nothing but hold Rosalie's hand and tell her she was doing well. But finally, as the sun was setting on the second day, their son was born. He came into the world squalling and red-faced, healthy and strong. The doctor pronounced both mother and child well, and Ethan found himself holding his son with shaking hands, overwhelmed by the tiny, perfect life they had created. "What should we name him?" Rosalie asked, exhausted but radiant. Ethan looked down at his son, at the tiny fingers curled around his thumb, and knew immediately. "Michael," he said. "His name is Michael." Rosalie's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled and nodded. "Michael Hawthorne," she said. "It is perfect." The winter that followed was challenging in different ways than the previous one had been. A newborn required constant attention, and there were many sleepless nights. But there was also joy in watching Michael grow, in seeing his first smile, in hearing his gurgles and coos. Samuel and Martha adored their new cousin, always wanting to help with him, and Helen proved invaluable in managing the household while Rosalie recovered her strength. Ethan found himself constantly amazed by his wife. She took to motherhood with the same determination she had brought to everything else, figuring out what worked and what did not through trial and error. She was patient with the baby even when she was exhausted, and she never complained about the demands being placed on her. For his part, Ethan discovered that fatherhood suited him. He loved holding his son, loved the weight of the baby in his arms and the way Michael would settle immediately when Ethan sang to him in his rough, off-key voice. He loved watching Rosalie nurse their son, the intimacy of those moments when it was just the three of them. Spring arrived again, bringing with it new life. The cattle had calved well, adding to their herd. Rosalie's garden, planted by Helen while Rosalie was still recovering, sprouted green and promising. Michael grew bigger and stronger, his eyes beginning to focus on faces, his smiles becoming more frequent. One evening in May, Ethan and Rosalie sat on the porch together, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. Michael was asleep in Rosalie's arms, and inside the house, they could hear Helen singing to Samuel and Martha as she put them to bed. "You ever think about that night?" Rosalie asked quietly. "When I showed up on your doorstep all the time," Ethan admitted. "I think about how close I came to not opening the door. I think about how different my life would be if I had sent you away." "Why did you not?" She turned to look at him. "Really, you could have. You would have been within your rights." Ethan was quiet for a moment, thinking back to that night, to the desperation he had heard in her voice, to the decision he had made in a split second that had changed everything. "I think part of me recognized something in you," he said slowly. "I had been so alone since Michael died. The house was empty, my life was empty, but I had convinced myself that was just how things were. Then you showed up, and suddenly there was another possibility. A chance for something different, something better. I lit all those lamps because I wanted you to see what you would be staying for. I wanted to show you that this could be a home, if you would let it be. It is a home, Rosalie said softly. The best home I have ever had. And you are the best thing that has ever happened to me, Ethan Hawthorne. He leaned over and kissed her, careful not to disturb the sleeping baby, and felt the familiar surge of love and gratitude that had become a constant presence in his life. I love you, he said. I do not say it enough, but I love you. You and Michael both. You are everything to me. I love you too, she replied, her eyes shining in the fading light. Thank you for opening the door. Thank you for telling me to stay. The years that followed brought both challenges and joys, as all lives do. There were hard winters and dry summers, sick cattle and broken equipment, all the trials that came with ranching in Wyoming. But there were also good times. Michael grew into a sturdy, curious boy who followed his father everywhere, asking questions about everything he saw. Helen eventually remarried to a widower in town who owned the general store, and she and her children moved there, though they visited often. Rosalie and Ethan had 2 more children, a daughter they named Emily after Ethan's mother, and another son they called Robert. The ranch prospered under their combined efforts, growing larger and more successful with each passing year. They hired help when they needed it, but the core of the operation remained the 2 of them, working side by side as they always had. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Ethan surprised Rosalie with a gift he had been planning for months. He had ordered a piano from back east, a beautiful upright that had taken weeks to arrive and had cost more money than he wanted to admit. But when he saw Rosalie's face as the delivery men carried it into the house, he knew it had been worth every penny. You said you used to play before you had to sell your piano, he said, suddenly nervous. I thought maybe you would like to play again. Rosalie ran her fingers over the keys, pressing them gently to hear the tones, and then she turned to him with tears streaming down her face. It is too much, she said. It is not nearly enough, he replied, pulling her into his arms. Not for everything you have given me. She played that evening, her fingers stumbling at first but quickly finding their remembered skill. The children gathered around her, enchanting, and Ethan stood in the doorway watching his family, thinking about how much had changed since that night she had appeared on his doorstep. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep and the ranch work was done, Ethan and Rosalie would sit together on the porch and talk about their life. They talked about their dreams for the children, about improvements they wanted to make to the ranch, about the future they were building together. But sometimes they talked about the past, about the strange series of events that had brought them together. You think Michael knew? Rosalie asked once. When he wrote that advertisement, do you think he knew what would happen? Ethan considered the question carefully. He thought about his brother, about the way Michael had always seemed to understand people in a way Ethan never had. He thought about the letter Michael had written to Rosalie, the one that had painted such an accurate picture of life on the ranch that she had felt drawn to it. I think he hoped, Ethan said finally. I think he hoped that whoever answered would be someone special, someone who could make me happy. And he was right. Rosalie leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars come out one by one over the Wyoming landscape. The children grew, as children do. Michael proved to have a gift with horses, able to gentle even the most skittish animal with patience and kindness. Emily loved the garden and the kitchen, spending hours helping her mother preserve vegetables and bake bread. Robert was the wild one, always getting into mischief and coming home covered in mud or with a new scrape or bruise from whatever adventure he had gotten into. Ethan taught them all to ride, to rope, to do the 100 small tasks that kept the ranch running. Rosalie taught them to read and write, to do figures, to appreciate music and poetry. Together, they gave their children a childhood that was rich in love if not always in material comforts. The town of Riverton grew slowly, adding new businesses and new families. Ethan served on the town council for several years, helping to make decisions about schools and roads and other civic matters. Rosalie became known for her charitable work, organizing help for families in need and teaching other women to read and write. They built a strong reputation in the community, known as hardworking, honest people who could be counted on to help their neighbors. The story of how they met became something of a local legend, told and retold until it took on almost mythical proportions. But Ethan and Rosalie did not mind. They knew the truth of it, knew that their love had been built on hard work and mutual respect, and a willingness to take a chance on something unknown. As the years passed, the ranch continued to prosper. They added acreage when neighboring properties became available, increased their herd, built better barns and outbuildings. But through all the changes, the heart of the place remained the same. It was a home built on love, a sanctuary carved out of the harsh Wyoming landscape through sheer determination and partnership. When Michael was 16, he fell in love with a girl from town, the daughter of Helen and her second husband. Ethan and Rosalie watched with amusement as their son awkwardly courted his cousin, bringing her flowers and stumbling over his words. They gave their blessing when he asked for it, and when the young couple married 2 years later, it was a joyous occasion that brought the whole community together. Emily eventually went east to attend a teaching college, something that broke Rosalie's heart even as it filled her with pride. She returned after 2 years with a degree and a quiet young man who was studying to be a doctor. They settled in Riverton, and Emily taught at the school while her husband established a practice. Robert proved to be a natural businessman. He started buying and selling cattle, then expanded into other ventures. By the time he was 25, he had made enough money to buy his own ranch, just north of his parents' property. He married a widow with 2 children of her own, and Ethan and Rosalie found themselves with even more grandchildren to spoil. As they moved into their later years, Ethan and Rosalie slowly began to hand over more of the day-to-day ranch operations to Michael and his wife. They still worked, still maintained a hand in everything that happened, but they also took time to simply enjoy each other's company. They would take long rides together across their land, pointing out to each other the changes they had seen over the decades. They would sit on the porch in the evenings, holding hands and watching the sunset, comfortable in the silence that comes from truly knowing another person. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren threw them a party. The ranch house was filled with people and laughter and music. Rosalie played the piano while their daughter-in-law played the fiddle, and one of the grandchildren played guitar. They danced together, Ethan and Rosalie, moving slowly and carefully but with obvious joy. "You remember that night?" Ethan asked her, just as he had asked so many times over the years. "Every detail," Rosalie replied, smiling up at him. "I remember being so scared, so desperate. I remember hearing your footsteps inside the house, not knowing if you would help me or send me away. And then I remember the lights, one after another, until the whole house glowed like a beacon." "Stay," Ethan said softly, echoing his words from 30 years ago. "Always," Rosalie promised, and kissed him to the cheers of their family. They had many more years together, watching their grandchildren grow and their great-grandchildren come into the world. The ranch continued to thrive under Michael's management, and the family name became synonymous with quality cattle and honest dealing throughout Wyoming and beyond. Ethan passed first, at the age of 78, peacefully in his sleep with Rosalie beside him. The whole community mourned his loss, and at his funeral, the church was filled to overflowing with people whose lives he had touched. Michael stood at the front and talked about his father's kindness and integrity, his willingness to take chances on people, his deep love for his family. Rosalie lived another 5 years, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who loved her deeply. She spent her days tending her garden, playing her piano, and telling stories about the old days to anyone who would listen. Her favorite story, the one she never tired of telling, was about the night she arrived in Riverton, desperate and alone, and the man who had opened his door and his heart to her. On the night before she died, sitting on the porch of the house she had called home for more than 50 years, surrounded by family, Rosalie told the story one more time. She told them about knocking on that door in the middle of the night, about the fear and desperation that had driven her there. She told them about how Ethan had opened the door, had looked at her with those steady eyes, and had made a decision that changed both their lives. He lit every lamp in the house, she said, her voice soft but clear. One after another until the darkness was pushed back and everything was warm and bright. And then he looked at me and said, "Stay," just that one word. Stay. And I knew I was home. She passed that night in her sleep, and they buried her beside Ethan on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a sky so big and blue, it seemed to go on forever. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren stood together and mourned, but they also celebrated. They celebrated a love that had started with a knock on a door and a single word, a love that had built a family and a legacy that would last for generations. The ranch still stands, now operated by the 4th generation of Hawthornes. The house has been expanded and modernized over the years, but the core of it remains the same. In the front room, hanging on the wall, is a photograph from Ethan and Rosalie's 30th anniversary party. In it, they are dancing together, their faces glowing with happiness and love. Beside the photograph is a small brass plaque that reads simply, "He lit every lamp and said stay," and she did. It is a reminder to all who see it that the greatest love stories often begin with the smallest acts of kindness, that opening your door to a stranger might be the best decision you ever make, and that sometimes, when you take a chance on someone, you end up finding everything you never knew you were looking for. The story of Ethan and Rosalie became a family legend, passed down through generations. Their great-grandchildren would sit at the feet of their elders and listen with wide eyes to the tale of the mail-order bride who showed up in the middle of the night, and the cowboy who lit every lamp in the house to make her feel welcome. It became a story about courage, about taking chances, about the power of a single decision to change the course of not just one life but many. And on quiet nights, when the wind howls across the Wyoming plains just like it did on that long-ago September night, some say you can still see lights glowing in the windows of the old ranch house, as if someone is still lighting lamps to guide a weary traveler home. But that is just a story, a romantic notion to cap off a romantic tale. The truth is simpler and perhaps more beautiful. The truth is that Ethan Hawthorne opened his door to a stranger one cold night, took a chance on a frightened woman with nowhere else to go, and in doing so, found the great love of his life. The truth is that Rosalie Kimball traveled 2,000 miles on faith alone, knocked on a stranger's door in the middle of the night, and found not just shelter but a home, a partner, and a family that would love her unconditionally for the rest of her days. The truth is that sometimes, in the midst of our darkest moments, when we are most desperate and afraid, someone will open a door and light a lamp and offer us a single word that changes everything. Stay. Such a simple word, but one that carries with it the promise of safety, of belonging, of home. One word that can mean the difference between a life lived alone and a life lived in partnership with someone who sees you, truly sees you, and chooses you anyway. Ethan and Rosalie chose each other, first out of necessity and convenience, but later, and more importantly, out of love. They built a life together from nothing, carved out a home from the harsh Wyoming wilderness, raised children and grandchildren who would carry on their legacy of hard work, honesty, and above all, love. Their story ended as all stories must, but the echoes of it continue. Every time their descendants make a decision to help a stranger, to take a chance on someone, to open their hearts and homes to those in need, they are honoring Ethan and Rosalie's memory. Every time they light a lamp against the darkness, they are remembering that long-ago night when a cowboy lit every lamp in his house to welcome a stranger who would become his everything. And so the story continues, generation after generation, a testament to the enduring power of love, compassion, and the willingness to take a chance on someone who might just change your life forever. It is a story that began with a knock on a door in a room full of lights, with a frightened woman and a lonely man, and it grew into something beautiful and lasting, something that would outlive them both and touch the lives of countless people who came after. In the end, that is the true measure of a life well lived, not in the acres owned or the cattle raised or the money made, but in the love shared, the family built, the legacy left behind. Ethan and Rosalie understood that, lived that, and in doing so, created something that would last far beyond their own lifetimes. The mail-order bride showed up in the middle of the night. The cowboy lit every lamp and said, "Stay." And from that simple beginning, everything else followed, a lifetime of love and partnership and joy, proof that sometimes the best things in life come from taking a chance when it matters most.